Hello and welcome. This is the Into the Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Byron Pace. It is the 2nd of November 2020 and got kind of a crazy week ahead of us. Huge elections in the US. Go out and vote. Have your voice heard. That is my only message for that. So it's going to be interesting to see what the outcome is at the end of the week. Over the border from where I live in Scotland, England is going back into 4 weeks of lockdown, people being asked not to leave their house again. Not quite sure what's going to happen in Scotland. We have a whole new tier system here. I know that there's quite a few countries over in Europe as well going back into lockdown as cases of coronavirus are rising. So stay safe out there, people. Don't go crazy and buy lots of bog roll like everyone seemed to do last time. And keep joining me on the podcast for a little bit of an escape from reality. But thank you so much for joining me this year in particular, but over the last couple of years. All of your comments on social, all of your rates and reviews, it really makes a massive difference and it keeps me going. It keeps me in the knowledge that I'm reaching people and hopefully making a difference with these amazing guests that I bring to your ears. So keep letting me know. Keep letting me know what you think, and I'm always open to suggestions. I get quite a lot of emails, actually, with suggestions for guests, and sometimes I manage to get those guests on. I really do try and get all the guests on that are suggested to me. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but I definitely do reach out to them. You can always contact the show with anything that's on your mind. Podcast at paceproductionsuk.com. Sometimes it takes me a week or two to get through that, depending on what's on my desk, but I will always get back to you and reply to the emails for the show. Anyway, to this week, I have an amazing guest. I have Amanda Monthei on, and we're going to be talking about fire, and particularly fire management and fire mitigation, and the use of fire as a tool in the landscape for positive outcomes for conservation and for humanity, actually. It's as big as that. We're going to be talking a lot about wildfires, the history of fire suppression and why that's been a problem. We're even going to talk about how fire affects fish, believe it or not. You probably have never thought of that connection before. We've got it covered. It's a topic that I am personally fascinated in. So I was really pleased to get Amanda on the show. If you want to check out other things that she's up to, you can follow her on Instagram, which is at @A_Monthei, MONTHEI, or amandamonthei.com for her website. But before we dive into it, I need to, of course, say thank you to my top-tier Patreons for this month, who include Richard Stevens, Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman of rdcontracting.co.uk, Tom McCraith, James Benjamin Normandale, James Marchington, the guys at South Ayrshire Stalking, Josh Starling, Thomas Cameron, and Mark Zabrowski. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you very much to every single other Patreon who is not a top-tier Patreon, and so you don't get your name shouted out, but it all makes a massive difference. Even if it's just for the value of a cup of coffee a month, it really helps me produce these shows and put more into it and be able to dedicate more time to it. If you would like to check out the Patreon page, it's just patreon.com/Byron Pace. We had a break from the competition that we normally run on every show 2 weeks ago, but it's back. So in conjunction with our partners on this show, Modern Huntsman, who really helped make this show even possible, we are giving away a copy of Volume 3. We've talked about Modern Huntsman a lot over the last couple of years, so there's some podcasts that you can go back and check out if you want to learn more, or just head over to modernhuntsman.com. In fact, if you go on there, you can check out my new monthly column, Into the Anthropocene. It's been running for 2 months now, and actually later today I need to put my brain into gear and put my third copy together. So I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to cover, but that will be out probably in the next week, actually. So if you've already read 1 and 2, 3 will be out in only a couple of days after this podcast goes to air. So all I would like you to do to be in a chance to win a copy of Volume 3 is it's going to be an Instagram and Twitter competition. So when this podcast goes out, just share it for the rest of the world to see that you are listening to the Into the Wilderness podcast. And as long as you tag me, I'll be able to see everybody who's done it. And I will pick somebody at random to win a copy of Volume 3, and I will announce your name on the show in 2 weeks' time. So that's it for me. I really hope you enjoy this intriguing conversation. Don't forget, if you want to check out more about things that I'm up to, follow on at Byron J. Pace pretty much everywhere. And you can also visit the website, www.byronpace.com. Amanda, welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. It's great to have another podcaster on the show. I don't get to interview other people who podcast all that often. How are you doing? What's it like to be on the other side of the mic?
This is very bizarre, yeah. But thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No, absolutely. Now, we're going to be talking and taking a deep dive into all things fire and fire management. But before we do that, because I don't, we haven't really had a conversation before, the two of us. What is a little bit of your background? Because I believe from listening to a few of your shows that you're actually a firefighter.
Yeah, I spent 4 years on fire crews. My last season was in 2019. I took this last fire season off to sort of reassess and maybe see what direction I wanted to go in, because I've always been a freelance writer. I've worked at a couple magazines. And so I felt myself kind of being pulled in two different directions. And so I kind of took this summer to reassess and see if I wanted to continue fighting fire or if writing was more of the path that I wanted to pursue. And what it showed me was that I'm still not really sure. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do next summer because I really do miss fire so much. But other than that, yeah, I started fighting fire 2016. I spent a season on an engine.
Just to interrupt you there, I'm curious to try and work out where in your life this started. How far out of school or whatever are you when you started fighting fire?
Yeah, I got out of college in 2013. I spent a couple years freelance writing at like little newspapers in Michigan, mostly writing about sports. I was a sports writer, writing about community events as well, kind of run-of-the-mill like newspaper reporter, and decided after a couple of years, I had a few friends that were both women actually who had fought fire while I was in college, and they'd continued to fight fire after we all got out of college, and it kind of just piqued my interest. I kept sort of looking at what they were doing and looking at their images and hearing their stories, and it really fascinated me. And so I was like, I'm thinking about this a lot. Maybe I should just maybe give it a shot and pursue it. So I took a few classes in 2015 and got on an engine in 2016 in northern Idaho and made the move out west that way.
That's incredible. We should probably preface with this by saying that, you've just alluded to it by the fact that this was in Idaho, but you're in the US. This kind of concept of fighting fire as someone who is not a full-time firefighter is something that is probably quite alien to people, certainly in the UK where I'm based and across Europe. I mean, we do have part-time people in the fire service, but it's not particularly common. And the kind of fires that we're fighting are very different. I mean, you're specifically talking about wildfires, aren't you?
Yes, yeah.
So just explain how that whole system works, because I've watched a couple of amazing documentaries about these people fighting these wildfires, and I think a lot of the fire service that are working on these people have a day job as well as doing this as a part-time job.
Yeah, it's interesting here. You're basically sucked into this sort of seasonal lifestyle when you choose to do fire, because you have at least 4 to 5 years, maybe more, before you are even technically qualified often for a permanent position. So especially with these federal agencies that we normally work for, I was an employee for the Forest Service, my 4 years of fire. They rely on a seasonal workforce, and that means you're working really hard for 6 months of the year, and then you're kind of just laid off and left to pick up the pieces afterward and maybe try to find a job in the off season. But more or less, you're often so burnt out from the summer that you're just relaxing, maybe skiing a bunch, But it is it is a really odd lifestyle where you're working, you're just completely consumed by this for 6 months of the year, and then you're just kind of dropped off okay, and we're done now. And then you don't have much to do through the winter. So as much Oh, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, I mean, is it actually viable? Are you paid enough to be able to see you through a whole year, or do most people end up going and getting another job? Is that kind of how the cycle works?
Yeah. So I think, you can collect unemployment. But I think a lot of people, the reason we get into fire is that we like that engagement. We like that level of engagement in our jobs. So I do think a lot of people end up getting jobs, working at a ski resort or maybe ski patrolling or doing arborist work or something like that. But it is. I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Oh no, I was just asking if most people tended to just do that. But I mean, you've kind of answered that by saying that a lot of people grab a second job in the other part of the year where they're not fighting fires, because the fire season is summer season, basically, is it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, April through November or October, generally speaking, and then yeah, I mean, I've worked at magazines in the off season, and I've found honestly that especially when you're on a hotshot crew, which generally have really really busy summers, it's hard to convince yourself to work in the off season. You don't generally make enough. Well, you can make enough money to sort of to swing going or to get by in the winter for sure, but we're not compensated all that well for what we do, and it's not really sustainable in the long term for a lot of people, and for me included. I think that was a big part of why I decided to get out of it when I did, was because I was like, I think I can find a way to make better money and not destroy my body this way.
It looks
and not
brutal.
Yeah, and it's not only that, it's like you're expecting it to be brutal, I guess, but you're not necessarily expecting the strain that it puts on your relationships, on your friendships, on your life in general. Like I was moving 6 to 7 hours away from my hometown, or from where I live now, to fight fire every summer, and that meant not seeing my friends all summer long. I was rarely coming back up because it was such a long drive. So you're just putting everything on hold, and I think that is a big part of what makes it unsustainable, because you really are so burnt out come November that you're like, do I really want a job this winter? Like, can I really swing that mentally, physically, emotionally?
Yeah, it's a lot. Now, we're going to talk a lot about fire management and the role of fire in the landscape, particularly pertaining to the podcast that you've launched. But before, just because I'm curious to know what the actual day-to-day and what that lifestyle's like through fire season, and also paint a picture. And I suppose this is probably very relevant to build this foundation before we go and talk more about the science and the future and what we need to learn about fire in the landscape. Is what is it actually like? Tell me what happens when you get a call and there's a wildfire. Like, just talk me through that experience.
Yeah, we're generally, I worked on a forest that didn't really burn a whole lot, so we were often traveling for fires, and so, they would call us. Maybe a fire popped in Utah, and they needed resources, and so they would call us, and we would get on the road and spend, maybe a day and a half on the road. We would get there, and then we would immediately sort of be plugged in to the situation. And those first few days on an emerging incident like that, on a new wildfire, are always, running and gunning, kind of a little wild. Nobody has a really firm grasp of what's going on yet, and that can be really unpredictable, and can be you just don't really know what kind of assignment you're walking into. And so I guess what that often looks like for hotshot crews specifically is, digging line, making sure that ground fires aren't able to continue spreading on the ground by just basically removing fuel, digging a sort of trench, I guess you could call it, and making sure that you have a break between, a fire break. When things are up in the trees, when the fire is up in the trees or spreading a little more, spreading a little more extreme, spreading faster, you can't really just dig a line and have that work. So that's when you start incorporating aircraft. You start incorporating operations like burnouts, where you're actually putting fire on the ground. That's a big part of what we do in fire is you're putting fire on the ground. You're using that fire's energy to sort of suck the energy out of the main fire, or to basically remove the fuel between you and the main fire.
So you're like back burning towards the fire.
Yeah, something like that. We call them burnouts. They, you can create a huge buffer with a burnout, and especially when you have swaths of forest that you are really trying to protect, or communities or subdivisions that you're trying to protect. Those things can be really effective if the weather's right. So that's honestly, those are the most fun assignments that we do. And those often happen when we're kind of running and gunning, when fires are burning really intensely. And then you also have days that are pretty mellow where you're what we call mopping up, where you're going out and literally putting your hands in stump holes and making sure nothing's hot. And if it is hot, putting water on it and mixing it up. And that's like the much less glorified version of firefighting that I think a lot of people don't realize is a major part of our job. We do that. We rehab areas that have been burned over already. We rehab fire line. We do a lot of chipping of brush and stuff that we had to cut out to create fire lines. There's a lot of not super glorious work that we do as well. But I think the fun stuff, the stuff that the reasons that we do this job are, those nights that we get to do burnouts, showing up to an incident that nobody really knows what's going on, and you're just kind of like trying to keep up with it. Digging line right next to the fire. Those are all that's kind of the reason we all get into it.
I can see the excitement factor in this. I mean, what kind of characters are drawn to this kind of work? Because it's definitely not going to be for everybody.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they often say it's type 1 or type A. I mean, not type 1, but type A people, maybe really relying on adrenaline, sort of need to be sort of constantly engaged by the work that they're doing. I think ADD and ADHD is actually, I don't know if it's been necessarily documented, but I do think a lot of people in this job have, maybe like a low level of ADHD where they're kind of always, they're kind of always trying to find something new to be engaged with, or they're kind of a little bit all over the place and need something intense to keep their attention focused. And I don't know, other than that, you do have the stereotype of the type A personalities of people that are, always kind of like seeking that, seeking leadership positions or trying to like sort of take control of situations. But you have a variety of people that get into this job. And I think the beauty of it is that I've heard it referred to as like an orchestra. The beauty of it is that you can find things for each one of these types of personalities to do. You can find ways to engage any different type of personality. And there are a variety of people that end up in this job that you wouldn't expect. I've worked with I've worked with women that are like incredibly feminine and incredibly like they have sort of all these traditional like feminine qualities about them. And then I've worked with dudes that were combat vets and are like really intense and really sort of almost overwhelming in their personality. And I've seen people from both of those sort of paths get along really well, become really good friends, in fact, through fire as a sort of medium to meet different types of people. I think that's what I appreciate sometimes the most about fire is the different types of people that you end up meeting along the way.
Yeah, I can see how that kind of extreme environment, especially one where you're relying on your teammates, can really pull people together and create bonds that you don't get in other walks of life. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what a couple hard shifts can do for the cohesiveness of a group. You can pull 20 people together who've never met, and or maybe 10 of them or 15 of them have met, but then you have 5 or 6 new people in the group, and you can become something like family within a couple of weeks. And that's almost always just a result of working really hard together and overcoming sometimes very insurmountable challenges together, oftentimes failing together too, I think contributes to that a lot. But it's cool. It's cool to see that sort of play out on the fire line and on fire crews.
Fire globally has been something at the forefront of most people's mind for the last sort of 18 months, 2 years. I mean, we've seen some massive fires in Australia. We've seen the Arctic on fire. Well, I think that the largest area in the Arctic burnt in history. We've seen multiple large fires in the States. We've had many fires over the last 2 years here in Scotland, a place where we don't really associate with wildfires. And everything that you've been discussing and we've been talking about for the start of this podcast has been fighting wildfires. But a lot of the discussion which needs to be had, and I think there's a greater realization of it now, is this idea of fire mitigation. And that really is a core of a lot of the conversations that you have on your podcast, which I really want to dive into. But maybe before we dive into that, what was the kind of catalyst that made you start your podcast? Now, I'm not sure if it's changed its name. I know that you had a name, but now you're, I think, changing the name of the podcast because I want to direct people towards it. So how can they find it?
Well, right now it's called Living with Fire. That's going to change in a couple of weeks because there's another fire organization called Living with Fire, and we're kind of confusing some people. So, but they can find me Living with Fire if you search it on Instagram. It should be one of the first things that comes up, and you can find me on Twitter as well, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all of that. When I do change the name, maybe I'll let you know. I will let you know actually what that name change will be.
Yeah, do that. We'll put it out. But because people will be able to find it. They can find it through you. But yeah. So what initiated you wanting to start that?
So there's a big sort of discrepancy, I think, in the perception of wildfire in the West, especially. I think a lot of people see it. Well, most people see it as this negative, destructive, sort of apocalyptic thing, when in reality, these forests and the landscapes that we live in have relied on fire and have coexisted with fire for millennia, for much longer than we've been around. And there's this gap that, we need to be suppressing these fires. We need to make sure that they're not affecting our communities. But I was sensing that, suppression isn't our only answer to a lot of these problems. And a lot of people think it is.
I'd say it's the cause of a lot of our problems, suppression.
It's the cause. Exactly. So we've been suppressing these fires for over a century, and it's caused, massive overgrowth, massive, bug kill. When we get droughts, it just affects it all a lot more substantially, I guess. So we have an immense amount of vegetation that hasn't burned in decades, if not centuries. And, that's creating more intense, larger, faster burning wildfires. So my objective was to sort of highlight some of these voices in the fire world that are saying, like, it doesn't have to be like this. We just need to, instill some of these policies that we've been sort of talking about for decades and that we know are going to be beneficial and that are going to work. And a big part of that is, or most of what they're talking about is prescribed fire, creating these sort of buffers around communities, building community resilience to wildfire, making sure that people understand that wildfire is actually very beneficial, and that a lot of the fire that we're seeing on the news and whatnot, that's a very small percentage of the amount of fire that's actually on the landscape most years. So as much as, we have these bad fires, we call them, we have these fires that, burn over communities, that destroy habitat. We also have to look to the fact that fire is necessary and that we need a good amount of good fire, and we need a huge amount of community education to understand the benefit of that fire. So that was kind of the objective, was to give us soapbox to a lot of these scientists and people who are working in this realm, who maybe don't have as much of a platform in like the storytelling realm, and just trying to get what they're doing out into the world and try to inform more people of what fire does for our landscapes.
Yeah, fire ecology is utterly fascinating to me, and it's something that I'm always intrigued by when I hear people talking about it, and I think I'm probably attracted to these aspects of land management, which are quite controversial because it has been, because like you say, most people view the fire that we're seeing across the world as entirely negative. And I think that it has been lost that fire is a natural component of cycles which help life proliferate. Here in Scotland, we have what we don't call it prescribed burning, but that's exactly what it is. We call it muir burning up in Scotland, which is this rotational burning of our heather moorland. The primary function of that is it's used as a management tool for grouse shooting in particular, but it does have a number of spin-off benefits. We'll probably need to do a whole podcast on that with somebody who's like an absolute expert in science on that. Although, as is often the case with fire, the science of fire management is there's a lot of gaps in it. So we have a lot of gaps in the knowledge of what are the benefits, what are the negatives of managing our uplands with fire. But one thing that it is for sure, and this goes to, I guess, a lot of the conversation that we're about to have, it is a very, very good tool for managing fuel loads. And all of that moorland that I'm talking about is on top of peat. And peat will burn, this underneath the ground, it will burn if you have very hot fires on top of it. And when we're talking about prescribed burning, we're talking about cool burns that are reducing fuel loads and minimizing the risk of very, very hot big wildfires in the future. But maybe what we can do just to kind of lay the landscape for how we've got to where we are today, and you can speak to this far better than I can, is some of the history of forest management, I suppose, more than fire management in the US in particular. I mean, Smokey Bear is the character that I think most, even if you're not from America, most people will think of Smokey Bear. Smokey Bear informing kids about the importance of, not leaving your barbecue and the risk that the risk of wildfire in the landscape,
right,
as a function of activities that we undertake as humans and being careful with fire. But in a way, as much as that was an incredible success, it was almost too much of a success, because it meant that people viewed anything that was not just fire, but anything that was fire and burning forests, or anything that was really involved in managing forests through, maybe rotational timber harvesting, stopped. It completely ceased. And this was on the back of some really, really big fires historically in America. But maybe you can talk more to that. I only kind of know little snippets.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I often bring up Smokey the Bear, and I have in the past anyway. And I spoke with a fire sociologist, which is like the craziest title to me. I just love that there's such a thing as a fire sociologist. They study the sort of societal impacts of wildfires. And she was like, Smokey Bear is like such a scapegoat for a century and a half of bad forest management. Like, we just blame Smokey the Bear. When in reality, we have to look at the sort of deeper picture. But you're totally right. I often, look to Smokey the Bear and I say, that really framed an entire generation's perception of fire, and it really sort of built this foundation of fire being bad from the 30s or 40s onward. But the foundation of our sort of problems right now seem to have started, obviously, Europeans showed up in the 1800s in the West and started making sort of cultural burning that was occurring on tribal land, everywhere, I guess, at that point. So indigenous people were doing these cultural burns, and it was done in a sort of cyclical nature. They were doing it to encourage plant growth and for a sort of cultural, just generally a cultural practice.
The basket weaving in Northern California is a really fascinating example of that.
Basket weaving is fascinating. Yes, that's going to be my next episode of the podcast as soon as
brilliant.
I have enough time.
I've just read a paper on it. It's really, really interesting.
It's fascinating. So the woman I talked to, the reason that she got her community and her tribe back into the practice of cultural burning was because she wanted to create baskets for her grandchildren. But the plant that they used to create the baskets wasn't growing anymore because they hadn't put fire in the landscape in so long. And so she was encouraged to start sort of advocating for more prescribed fire on her, in the land surrounding their area, because she wanted to be able to create baskets for her grandchildren as she started having more grandchildren, as her kids started having kids. And I thought that was fascinating. And that's what my next episode is going to be about with, her name's Margot Robbins. Anyway, I think that really sort of framed the whole, what happened for the next century and a half was, making these cultural burns illegal and sort of colonizing the ways that we interact with the landscape in the mid 1800s. And then that led to this fire suppression management model that we have been sort of stuck with since then. And that was all perpetuated massively by the 1910 burns, which killed dozens of people, burned millions of acres of land.
Because those are the
biggest.
Those are still the biggest single fires in history in the US, aren't they? The 1910.
Yes. Although some fire ecologists are saying that this summer, with the huge sort of a weather event that we had in early September on Labor Day weekend or immediately following Labor Day weekend. We had this huge wind event that's really rare and it was rather historic. And we already had a lot of fire on the ground before that wind event occurred. And when it did occur, it was, these 50, 60 mile an hour winds coming from the east, which is rare. And that caused a huge spike in fire behavior over the course of that week. And so a lot of fire ecologists are saying that that might have, yet to be determined because of acreage and whatnot, but that could have been a bigger week in fire behavior than the 1910 burns were.
Amazing.
That's yet to be determined, but that's
possible.
That's the extreme nature of the fire season that we had this year.
Am I right in thinking that the 1910 fires started because of the old steam railways spitting sparks out the top of the
huge part of that?
Yeah.
Yes,
because that was
exactly.
I can't remember where I was reading this, but something. And they were saying that these rail tracks that were basically transecting all of North America, they were just sparking these little fires everywhere in the forests because of the coal and wood smokes and embers that were flying out the chimneys of these steam engines.
Yeah, so we were starting these fires. We had this massively destructive fire season. And we weren't necessarily prepared for it. And that led to us just saying like, okay, fires need to be put out as soon as possible. We need to suppress these things as quickly as possible to prevent infrastructure damage, damage to communities, deaths, anything like that. Also at that point, a big part of that was timber, I think
as a crop.
After that, it was just
as a crop, for value.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and also agriculture and agriculture as well. So that just sort of led to a perception of fire, a very negative perception of fire for the next 100 years. And we're kind of still living with that. And I think people started to recognize in the 70s and the 80s that prescribed fire would be very beneficial and that we needed to start introducing more of it. But the public perception of fire just in general, whether it's prescribed or wildfire, has still traditionally been pretty negative. You get a lot of smoke in the air that really perpetuates health issues for people, for certain populations. That's a big part of why we aren't prescribed burning more than we are right now, is that they produce smoke, and you have to be really cognizant of that, of air quality in a lot of these communities. But yeah, that's kind of the basis of it. And I think we've been fighting ever since, the 70s, 80s to sort of reverse the idea that we need to be putting these fires out as first thing in the morning, basically. This is the
before 10 a.m.
The 10 a.m. rule, exactly. So that was basically, we have a fire start overnight, or we have a fire start at 6 p.m. at night. That thing needs to be out by 10 a.m. the next morning, and that's that. And that was basically the umbrella sort of policy for forest management, for fire management in the United States from like the 30s until like the late 60s, early 70s, even into the 80s and 90s, from what I've heard from people who worked in fire in those decades. Like people in the 90s and the early 90s were still being told we need these fires out by 10 a.m. Whether or not that was the general sort accepted policy, that was still being told to people in the 90s. So at this point, we're still trying to reverse the damage caused by those policies, by that sort of full suppression policy, and that fire doesn't belong in these landscapes, and that we need to protect our infrastructure and our communities and our lives by putting them all out.
So what was it in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s that made people start to realize that actually we need to think about fire? Yes, there are some fires which we need to suppress to protect life, but we also need to think of fire as a management tool. What was it that suddenly made people think, oh, hang on a second, maybe there's a problem with suppressing all these fires?
I am not really sure about that, actually. That's a great question. I talked to Stephen Pine about this, and I think that there was just this general sort of, and I don't remember what he said specifically, but I feel like maybe there was just this general cultural movement towards recognizing that these natural processes are natural, in fact, and that in many of these landscapes rely on these natural processes, and that maybe interacting with these processes in the way that we had been isn't necessarily beneficial. I can't say explicitly why that happened. I'm trying to remember maybe some of the policies that came through, or maybe some of like the different people who were involved with that conversation at that time, but I can't
I think he did mention, I think one of the examples that he gave is that germination of some plants actually require fire. So if you do not have fire in the landscape, you will lose those plants. And I know I wrote an article for Modern Huntsman a couple of volumes ago that was looking at grouse globally. And we were looking at ruffed. I was writing about ruffed grouse, which I actually I had no real personal experience of that particular species of grouse. But in the research that I was doing, one of the issues behind the massive decline across almost all of North America was the fact that they need sort of successional forests to survive as part of their life cycle. And I mean, not just them. There is a whole host of particularly bird species that require this. And they were used to getting it through this sort of natural cycle of fires, burning little bits of old growth forest down, which would then regenerate. But this very sort of protectionist view of fires across North America resulted in them essentially just not having the habitat that they need for their natural life cycle. And so in some places, they'd lost 98% of the populations that they'd had in the early 1900s. And I know that realization started to come in like the 70s, 80s. And I dare say there was probably other species where people were saying, why have we lost all these species? And some of it was down to the fact that there just was no natural fire in the landscape anymore.
Yeah, I mean, we often forget that these species have been around a lot longer than we have, and that they're fire adapted. Trees are fire adapted. Trees on the West Coast in most landscapes are fire adapted. Plants are as well. Animals are as well. I was talking to you earlier before we started recording about how steelhead are adapted to fire, and trout are adapted to fire, and how we often think. I've had a lot of people ask me recently, especially in the wake of the Archie Creek fire that affected the North Umpqua. A lot of people are wondering how that's going to impact that population of steelhead. And the answer is that these fish have been well adapted to these environments for millennia. And even if maybe our fires are burning a little bit more severely than they have in the past, or maybe in some cases even quite a bit more severely, those, whether they're low, moderate, or high severity fires, those things have a place in these ecosystems, and they have a place in the life histories of these trout and steelhead and salmon. And in fact, the reason that we have such hardy, healthy steelhead in a lot of places is because of fire, and because they have these sort of disturbances to their habitat on a regular basis, whether they're floods or landslides or fires. They rely on those disturbances. They rely on a highly complex environment to stay healthy and to adapt well to where they're living. And the biologist I talked to about that, Gordy Reeves, I thought this was really profound. He said, we don't need to be protecting these places. We need to be protecting the processes. And so we need to be sort of protecting the process that fire plays, or the impact that fire plays on a landscape. We need to be protecting that. We don't need to be protecting the landscape from fire. We need to be recognizing that fire has a huge impact and is often wildly beneficial for these places. And we need to make sure that we're upholding that in a place that has had fire for millennia. And not only that, but maybe not doing as much erosion control, because in fact, a lot of streams rely on that sediment that comes in the immediate aftermath of wildfire. Habitat, those sediment flows create habitat. They bring in nitrogen and other compounds into the stream. These are all pretty necessary for fish growth, for aquatic insect growth. There's a number of ways that fires benefit. It's a very, very complex
web. And you're so right. It's I think there is a tendency for us as humans to, and I'm going to say something here which is slightly contradictory. There's a tendency for us to want to control every aspect of the natural cycles, but equally we have already changed the landscape so much that I think we're in a position now where we have to be part of that management, but have a realization of what these natural cycles are. And that goes to using fire as a management tool, or being careful about, like you were talking about. I mean, that's something I hadn't really considered. I sit on a fisheries trust here, and we're often looking about at sediment runoff from forestry planting, for example, into rivers. Now, for obvious reasons, if you have sediments that cover spawning redds, then suddenly the salmon can't spawn or the ova can't hatch. But there is a certain amount of that cycle where you're used to, where it's a natural component to have sediment get pooled into river systems, and then that creates an entire habitat for insects to hatch, which is then the food that the fish feed on. It's a very, very complex web.
It is. And it's a hard balance. Like you said, it's really hard to balance the fact that we have had such a huge hand in managing these landscapes for the last century. And so therefore, we're kind of interwoven at this point. We can't just step back and be like, never mind, we're just going to let the natural world, do its thing and not have any sort of management over it. Because at this point, we have dams in place, we have infrastructure, we have, our water quality. We have all these things that are in place that we kind of need to make sure that we manage well. But we also need to recognize just the place of these processes in what's, I guess, in like the foundation and in the formation of the landscapes that we love. So it's a hard balance. I don't really know how to manage that balance. And in fact, I asked Gordy about this as well, and he really didn't know. But it's
well, that's the great question, isn't it?
It's something that it's fun to think about. It is. So, it's fun to think about.
When you were digging into the steelhead story, was it the case that fire suppression had impacted populations, or what was the kind of outcome of that? What was it that made you look into that in the first place? I mean, it's intriguing because most people don't think fire fish; they think fire things that live on land.
Yeah, I think that I've had an interest in this since I started fighting fire because I am an angler as well. And so I've always wondered how fire might impact the things that I love to do outside of fire season. And this was just one of the many sort of strains of this story that I've been pursuing. I've written about cutthroat in Utah, and I have a story about that coming out on Patagonia's website soon. And I wanted to just sort of extend that to steelhead and see if there were any real differences in how steelhead interact with fire versus cutthroat. And really, there's not. I mean, the sort of foundational idea here is that fire and fish have coexisted for forever, and that they will continue to do so, that they will likely be just fine, despite maybe a rise in higher severity fires that are largely caused by, climate change or suppression. And I think one of the things Gordy was saying was that we anticipate, or that we expect to sort of fish and enjoy rivers in these really scenic, beautiful landscapes, that we expect to go and fish the North Umpqua in these beautiful old growth forests that are really green and really healthy seeming, when in reality, we need these sometimes stand replacing fires, or at least fires that come out and burn through this underbrush. We need those things to refresh and refresh these systems. We need, a steelhead especially need these regular disturbances in order to actually thrive. And if you have an old growth forest that hasn't burned in thousands or in hundreds of years, those steelhead aren't being required to adapt to their environment in any sort of beneficial way. So, there's a place for old growth, of course. And of course, we don't want our old growth burning. But when they do burn, just recognize that they've always burned, and that this is part of the sort of process, and that those, maybe I think Gordy said that the biodiversity of a forest. You said secession earlier, but yeah, the of a forest following a wildfire, with whether it's maybe 6 months out or a year out or 5 years out, that biodiversity is almost more than you would get in an old growth forest, and you need that biodiversity. You need that refresh of that ecosystem to really help those fish. That it gives them more food. It gives them a greater chance for evolving into that environment. It gives them a challenge, and a lot of these fish, they're hardy because of these challenges. They're healthy because of these regular challenges. So I thought that was really interesting, I guess.
That is interesting. And just to go back to something that you brought up about protecting the natural cycles rather than a particular element of the environment. And I think that goes or speaks to the conservation movements and how we're thinking about conserving species, and whether we should really be thinking about conserving a species as most of the public might view it, which is this static thing. Whereas really what we should be doing is conserving the systems that exist, whether that, at whatever level, that allow the continued, and it's very hard for people to think of this because it's over such a long period of time, but the continued evolution of these species, because nothing is static. We are always moving to some point in the future where things will be different. Where, I mean, there is examples of very rapid evolution that we're seeing in certain species, over almost the period of a lifetime. And it's protecting these systems to allow that to continue to happen, just the same as allowing these natural cycles to function the way that they always have. And fire is one example of many where we basically put the brakes on it and we killed that cycle.
Right. And as humans, it's really hard to recognize that while our favorite fishery might have been burned over by a stand replacing fire, by something that was so severe that it burned all the way down to mineral soil, it's hard to see that, maybe our favorite fishery isn't going to be fishable for the next 10 years. But we have to think, these things did happen regularly, or did happen historically, maybe not on a regular basis, but they did happen historically. And those systems recovered, and they recovered over the course of 15, 20, 50 years maybe.
Yeah. Which is inconvenient for us because we only live for
it's so
65
exactly.
to 70 years of really good time where we can get out and fish and hunt. Exactly. So yeah, it's really inconvenient for us, but really these cycles and the natural world around us isn't entirely there just for our own pleasure. And we need to consider these much longer time horizons in our land management. And I think that really speaks a lot to the issues that we face, not just in fire, but in many other aspects, from fire to agriculture to how we manage our marine systems and our fisheries, is that our time horizons are far too short.
Yeah, it's a bummer to think my favorite river isn't going to be fishable, or might not even have fish for the next 10 to 15 years. But it's worth recognizing that these processes have taken place historically and are altogether pretty necessary for the viability of these systems.
Do you think, a lot of the discussion that we've been having has been essentially focused around the ecology of these environments. But do you think one of the problems that we have trying to explain the use of fire as a management tool, do you think that's tied to the climate change debate? Because we have it so drilled into us now that it's all about locking carbon down into the ground. We've got to lock it into biomass so that it's not going into the atmosphere. And as soon as somebody sees a fire, they think, well, look at all that carbon going into the atmosphere. And this is something that we face here. It's one of a number of arguments, but one of the primary arguments against managing the heather moorland in this sort of rotational mosaic that they have is, well, this can't possibly be good for our attempts to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. This can't possibly be good in our efforts to halt climate change if we're burning the landscape. And clearly everybody can, from miles away, they can see the smoke going up into the air. So it's a very visual example of what's happening. And I think that there's a really poor understanding of the risk. And I had this discussion very briefly at the end of a podcast recently when we were talking about, it was actually a really fascinating discussion about carbon capture and when sometimes planting trees, you actually end up with a worse state and less carbon captured than if you just left the land in these sort of, more shrubby, short bushes on peatland. We were specifically talking about heather moorland. And I asked the question at the end and said, what is the risk analysis for this? So even if we have a case where, okay, we now have a landscape that has a lot more trees in it, if we are not also putting in place a very careful management system to mitigate the risk of having very big wildfires, which then go and burn this huge store of carbon subsurface, then is this really something that we want to do? What is our risk analysis for the future chance of having fire in the landscape, and how should we be managing to mitigate against that? And I don't think that's really thought of. It's great to have all of this incredible biomass above the above ground level, and have these huge flourishing forests, but that is an incredible fuel load. And that goes to a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here, about protecting these fuel loads and not managing them, and then the problems that proliferate as a result of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought of this, but I find it interesting that you guys talk about climate change from that perspective of we're releasing all of this carbon into the atmosphere through these fires, because I haven't heard that perspective in the US. That's something I actually have never really considered. So the way that we talk about climate change in fires is that they're being proliferated by climate change, and that, obviously that human-caused climate change is affecting the severity and the speed and the intensity of these fires. But I'm not really sure. I'm not sure on that. It's hard to say.
I just wondered whether that was maybe one of the barriers for prescribed burning, because what you say is right. Like this is brought up. We're having just the same as you guys. We're having hotter summers that are longer, that are drier, so that there's less precipitation, and it creates a much easier environment for fires to take hold and run. And so
exactly.
in that regard, the wildfires are partly as a result of the environment that's being created by global climate change. But on the other hand, when we're actually looking at fire mitigation measures and using it as a management tool, then you have the same people who are talking about what a terrible thing this is, that climate change is exacerbating the wildfires, are saying, oh no, well, you can't then go and use fire as a management tool to help reduce fuel loads, to reduce the risk of having large fires. Because look what you're doing. You're burning biomass, you're putting carbon into the atmosphere. And yes, that is absolutely true. But you need to work out what the net gain is. And I just wondered whether this very, very intense focus on what can we do to lock carbon and to pull it out of the carbon cycle is one of the barriers that we face to using fire as a management tool. And in my mind, it's just so important that we really understand what our risks are and what our gains are. Yeah,
to me, I'm not a scientist. I have to make that disclaimer. I should have done that at the beginning. But I will say, I think like the smoke thing is definitely a barrier in the United States. The exacerbation, or maybe the creation of smoke, or the releasing of carbon isn't much of a conversation here. But I will say, I don't know. I think that there's still that risk of reward thing. I think there's a huge risk in putting more smoke into the air, especially in the off season when people, are going to be, they've already dealt with fire season smoke. They don't want to deal with more smoke. But I think the reward is that while you're releasing some of this carbon, maybe you're encouraging more plant growth that may or may not benefit us in the future in a similar way. I don't know. I'm not really sure on that one.
Yeah, I was really just thinking about it as we were talking. So this is me just spewing my mind thoughts onto you.
I like it. That's fun to think about, though. That's something I haven't considered in the past, but I might have to think about that one a little more.
So what are the, from the discussion that you've been having with people on the podcast and through your writing and through your own life experience, what measures are being put in place, and what does fire management look like in the US, and where do people want to see it going, so that we can find this balance?
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act for sure. It's not only more prescribed fire, but it's changing the sort of regime of prescribed fire, like the structure of prescribed fire that we've accepted as being that we've accepted over the last 30, 40 years. The current structure of prescribed fire isn't doing the amount of work that we need to do at this point. And so I think moving forward, people are looking at decentralizing prescribed fire and putting it back into the hands of landowners, of tribal members, of local fire practitioners, of communities, and sort of taking that authority over the land away from maybe these federal agencies that often don't have the funding or the resources to really do a whole lot. And in fact, the federal government, most federal land agencies, except for the Bureau of Land or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, have stagnated their prescribed fire over the last 20, 30 years. So they're not doing as much as we think they're doing, and they're not improving, or they're not increasing their prescribed fire load. So it's like, how can we make sure that we're doing what we need to be doing? And I think the answer to that for a lot of people right now is creating these sort of prescribed fire associations in their communities, and finding the funding to do prescribed fire sort of buffers in their own areas and protecting their own communities and sort of taking that authority over the land in their own backyards. Another part of that is the sort of balancing act is going to be education and making sure people understand that while there's going to be a little bit of smoke in the air from these prescribed fires, it's going to ultimately benefit us in the future. It's going to ultimately prevent more of these large, fast-burning wildfires coming into or threatening our communities in the future. It's going to ultimately, maybe 10, 15 years down the road, it's going to ultimately maybe lessen the smoke impact on our communities in the middle of fire season. Another thing is actually, I'm writing a story about this for another magazine right now, is managing wildfires to do some of this forest management work. So we have something like 98% of the wildfires that burn in the U.S. and in the West Coast, especially, aren't anything eventful. They're put out within a couple days. They burn a couple hundred acres. It's pretty, it happens. It's put out. Nobody hears about it. It doesn't end up on the news, and it usually burns in areas that aren't necessarily threatening any infrastructure or any communities. And the new idea in the fire, not new necessarily, but an idea in the fire world now is to allow those fires to do some of this forest management for us, so that we don't have to sit around and think about how we can get these prescribed fires that might only burn a couple hundred acres done, when we can just allow fires burning maybe in May or June or July when extreme heat isn't a problem or extreme wind events aren't a problem. If we have the right weather in place, if we have the right management in place, like we have our fire lines in place and we have the right amount of resources in place, maybe we can allow these fires to do some of that forest management for us, and we can get a lot more done that way. We can do what's called box and burn. We can establish a large chunk of land that we need burned by cutting out roads and making sure that those fire lines are well established, and then doing a burnout maybe. And that can burn thousands of acres versus a couple hundred acres that would normally be burned during a prescribed fire. So this sort of balancing act, because, you also think about if one of those things got out, which is rare, but, if something were to happen and that were to threaten a community, we also have to think about that community being resilient to the potential for those fires, and also any wildfire in general. So it's managing wildfires for greater forest health, for greater, allowing more fire on the landscape. It's prescribed fire, it's community resilience, it's community education. It's just this huge balancing act, and it's very complex, but it's, I guess, our problem is pretty complex, and so the answers are naturally going to be complex.
Absolutely. As with most things in the natural world, especially when it comes to our interaction with it. There's been a lot of discussion, not just in the States, but I know that I saw it in a couple of articles in newspapers, just kind of at the end of the big wildfires in Australia, which only really came to an end because it started to rain, not because of anything that we managed to do, is sort of resurrecting and embracing the indigenous knowledge of these landscapes. And you talked about this right at the start of the podcast, where these landscapes had been managed with fire for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And a lot of that knowledge has, to some extent, it was certainly suppressed, much like the fire, as European settlers moved into these different places. But some of it has been lost, or it's not as widely known anymore. And yet it's incredibly valuable. I mean, the basket weaving example that we discussed very briefly is one example of many.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's just a lot of that perspective that came from cultural burning, or not even came from, but that contributed to cultural burning. The idea that we are like interwoven with our landscapes, that we rely on our landscapes just as much as anything else. Like we're a part of this landscape, and therefore, we maybe do have a hand in in encouraging plant growth in doing these burns. And I don't know, it's hard to explain because I haven't gone into this a ton, and I haven't talked to a ton of guests about this yet. And I can't wait to learn more. And in fact, I'm going to do a full series about indigenous burning on the podcast.
I'd be fascinated. I'm looking forward to that. I really looking.
I can't wait to learn more about it.
There's so many intriguing aspects. I remember I read, and I need to try and find this paper again, and so that I can speak more articulately on it. I think it could have even been the same paper that was talking about the basket weaving, and how that particular tree that regrows with fire basically stopped existing, or it stopped existing in a way that it could be used for this. It could be used for basket weaving. But I had also read something about fire being used to shade rivers. This is going back to fish, to shade rivers in very, very hot summer months. Where it was, the heat reduces the oxygen in the waterways and can sometimes affect the fish. And indigenous tribes in these places would burn rivers to actually drop smoke into these valleys and shade the rivers from the sun, which I thought was fascinating.
I haven't heard of that.
I will dig that out again because it was utterly fascinating. And you think to yourself, we would never think of doing something like that now, and yet. I don't even think in the paper they talked about how long they thought that might have gone on for, and I don't know if there's anybody alive today that would even be able to tell you how long that would have gone on for. But it's just fascinating to think of these human interactions historically in a time where we maybe don't fully appreciate how much we interacted in the landscape in a much more sympathetic and symbiotic way.
Exactly. Symbiotic is a good word for that.
But it's oddly fat. Well, I'm looking forward to you getting some guests on so that we can both learn more about the indigenous knowledge of fire.
I can't wait. I'm hoping to talk to a wildland firefighter and fire manager in the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin, and I believe I'm talking to him tomorrow. And I'm looking forward to getting his perspective, especially just because I haven't spoken to anybody in the Midwest yet, and they're using fire to manage their tribal lands in that area. And I thought that was fascinating. And I'm hoping to talk to a few more people, kind of in the. It would be nice to get somebody in the Rockies, Idaho, or something, because I also. Or not in the Rockies, but in the Great Basin, in Colorado too. I've only ever spoken with anybody from that Northern California, the Karuk tribe, and I think I'd like to get a broader idea of how it was impacting different areas and different tribes in different areas. So, I don't know. I wish I knew more about it right now. I can't wait to talk to more people and get a little bit better idea of kind of what that looked like and how that looks now.
Mm-hmm. Just as a way of finishing up, because I'm aware that we didn't really talk about the details of what this actually entails. But when you're looking at prescribed burning for managing forest, this isn't a case of just burning the whole forest down. This is cool burns. You're often burning the understory and the fuel loads that exist like just above the surface, like fallen timber and smaller trees. Just explain to me how that works.
Yeah, you're often doing these burns in the rainy season or just on the precipice of the rainy season. So you're doing it in October, November, maybe March, April, May, and you are looking for these sort of really specific weather conditions where the humidity is high, but not so high that you're not going to have viable fire spread. And then, of course, temperatures being mild. You don't want them too low, you don't want them too high, and preferably no wind. Wind is not really ideal when you're doing prescribed fire, when you're putting fire on the ground in general. So you're looking for these very specific weather conditions. And oftentimes that means you're burning leaf litter, you're burning needles, you're burning underbrush. And oftentimes, you're burning in forests where the trees are already fire adapted. And a lot of the trees are, maybe you have these older growth trees or these larger trees that have been they've seen fire, they know they're fire adapted, but you're wanting to maybe burn out some of the smaller trees that might be taking resources away. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but essentially you're burning the understory. It's really mild. It's low intensity, and you're rarely burning, the crowns of trees.
Yeah.
Fire is rarely getting into the trees themselves.
So it doesn't look like the apocalypse once you're finished. There's still standing trees. There's still leaves in the upper canopies.
Exactly. And you're still getting a huge amount of smoke. And that's what a lot of people get freaked out by that. And that's understandable. That's a huge, and that inhibits a lot of, or not inhibits, but that is something that is often thought about when planning these prescribed fires, is how much smoke can we really put in the atmosphere today, or in this community, or at this moment, or how many acres can we burn today that will, not meet that threshold of how much smoke we can put out. So, you're still seeing a lot of smoke, but it's often very low intensity. It's the sort of historical norm for these sorts of landscapes. And it's actually often pretty fun. I've done a lot of prescribed fire. And if things go right, which they often do, it can be an enjoyable experience. And it's always fun to put fire in the ground, especially when things are mild and the wind isn't burning, or the wind isn't blowing, and things aren't burning really intensely, which is often what a burnout looks like on an actual wildfire. But yeah.
I never asked you this question at the start, but I'm not sure if you'll actually have the numbers on the top of your head, but I'm curious to know, of all the fires that pop up, how many of them, or what proportion of them are initiated by humans being stupid, and how many of them are natural causes, and what would naturally actually cause a fire to start, apart from lightning? I think most people are, lightning would be the one that springs to most people's minds.
I think something like 9 out of 10 fires are started by humans.
Okay, so we are
this
just
summer
stupid.
We had a huge yeah, and it's often, whether it's cigarette butts or campfires that haven't been put out, or a lot of the fires that I've responded to that are human caused are chains, somebody leaving a chain on the back of their trailer and having it spark on the expressway, and then starting a fire next to the expressway, like really random things that are like, okay, well, that was dumb, but it's not like it's not that nefarious.
Yeah.
But it's often, I think one of the biggest fires I've been on resulted from a guy burning weeds in his yard with like a flamethrower.
Oh yeah. The little gas guns. Yeah.
But I think this summer was kind of unique in that we had a lot of lightning strikes. A lot of the fires that became complexes became these huge proliferations in California were started by lightning strikes. We had a lightning storm come through in August, and I believe another one in September. And that's why a lot of those fires, when that east wind came in early September, there was already a lot of fire on the ground, and a lot of those fires hadn't been started by humans. And so that's when you're like, okay, these things did happen traditionally. This is historically what fire seasons looked like. You get a huge lightning bust, and you have 2 or 3 of these small fires grow into each other and become a big fire. And then a huge wind event comes in, and there's nothing we can do about any of that. There's nothing that we did to contribute to any of that. I mean, obviously there's the management of these forests and how overgrown they are. That absolutely contributes to how fast they spread. But the actual act of lightning striking and then wind coming in and blowing these fires up is all natural. It's all historically sound. So, this was a unique summer for that, I think. And then, of course, you have people that like the gender reveal party that started the El Dorado fire.
That was ridiculous.
Which is ridiculous.
That was in California,
resulted in
was it?
a firefighter. It was in California, Southern California. And it resulted in a firefighter death. And it's like, it's a whole nother topic, but gender reveal parties, man, I am just I'm just over it. I'm over gender reveal parties, especially when you're using tannerite to do it.
It was fireworks. It was fireworks that set it off, was it?
No, I think it was the things that you it was tannanite or tannerite that you would shoot to. It's like it's an explosive that you shoot, and you can load them with whatever color you'd like. And I think that was what caused it.
So it's like blue. Yeah. It's a boy.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize that. I mean, it's just
you go to a shooting range and you set it up. And I've actually watched these things. I have redneck friends, so I've seen this happen. I just have never seen it happen in August during a red flag warning.
It's just dumb.
In Southern California.
It's just a dumb human. And you'd think living, especially in California, that people would know. I mean, the fires there for the last couple of years have been terrible. I think some of the second biggest fire in California in history was last year or the year before. Single burn. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and we're looking at fires that are 300,000 acres now regularly. And so, yeah, it's a tough balance. I don't know. Maybe Smokey the Bear needs more of a presence in Southern California with these people.
Maybe. Brett, get Smokey. In fact, he doesn't need to go in the other states.
Bring
Just
Smokey in.
Send Smokey in. Amanda, it's been brilliant to speak to you. It's a really fascinating topic that I don't know whether it's just because I'm like a closet pyromaniac, or whether it's just the complexities of the science and fire ecology that fascinates me. But it's something that I've always been intrigued by. I've really enjoyed listening to your podcast series, specifically tackling this fire in the landscape and how we manage it and how we use it. So thank you so much for coming on today and giving us a little bit of an insight.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed your questions. It was, some of them were challenging, and I can't wait to do some research and look up some of the topics that we talked about.
I mean, we're always learning. This is the great thing. I mean, this is why I do podcasts, is because you get insights from guests that just make you think or evaluate an opinion or a point of view in a different way, and then you can either go off on a tangent with them, or you end up thinking, I really need to look into that a little bit more, because sometimes we don't think of all the questions that we want to actually know the answers to. So no, I really, really appreciate your insights and your time.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Byron. I really appreciate it.